So welcome everyone to ELA Help for Homeschool Parents. I'm so happy you're here or watching later. And my name is Kelly Sage. If we don't know each other, I am a homeschool mom. I have homeschooled for the last, since my daughter was 3, she's 14. So we're going on year 11. And then I'm also an English teacher, and I taught in public schools. I've taught in private schools. But the last 11 years since I started homeschooling, I have taught online. And then I also work for a local creative writing nonprofit here in Indiana, and I lead creative writing circles for adults, and I used to also do it for children. So I am by no means an expert in all things ELA, but I do have some experience and some ideas and some things that I know have worked time and time again. And so I'm just happy to be here and share them with you and hope that it can be helpful as you continue or begin your homeschool journey. Okay, so we just have a basic agenda here. I'm going to talk about helping reluctant readers. Now, these readers may be reluctant because they would much rather be playing video games or playing in the creek, or they may be reluctant because reading is really hard. They may be reluctant because they just don't like the books that they're reading. So there's lots of, we'll talk about different ways that we can help our reluctant readers. Same with writers. We're going to talk about ways to encourage, motivate kids to write, whether it's just that they just hate writing, they don't know what to write about, or there is some kind of challenge that they're having. And then I'm also going to just share with you some of the ways that over the years, my family and I have worked together to set goals, to really know our expectations for the year ahead, and to set schedules. It took a long time for us to kind of find a rhythm, but once we did, it was something that we could use over and over again and continue to use. And it's really made a big difference in the way that my kids learn and in the way that we homeschool. So I'll share some of those. And then again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box. There'll be 2 times where I stop just to answer questions if there are any. And yeah, happy to help in any way that I can. Okay, so let's just kind of dive in here. So one of the things that I did as a classroom teacher, and now I do as an online teacher, is help students who are reluctant or struggling when it comes to reading. And I was fortunate enough to go to a really great school for teachers. They gave me a lot of the resources 20 plus years ago that I continue to use today. So I didn't just like come up with these on my own. They are from studies and people who have really worked in the field of reading. And then as I have continued to work with students and tried different things, here are the things that I find time and time again so very helpful. Okay, and this again is for any child, not just a child who is reluctant or struggling, but especially for someone who is reluctant or struggling. So the first thing is choice. Nobody wants to do something that's hard or they don't want to do, right? Like none of us want to, adults as well. Kids don't have maybe the same motivation that we do. Like I don't particularly like doing my taxes or paying my bills, but I'm motivated because I want to have my house. Kids don't have that kind of motivation always. So choice can be such a great motivating factor. What that means is sometimes we have to let go of wanting our kids in that moment, especially if they're reluctant or struggling, to read like the classics or our favorite books or a specific genre that we think they need to read in 7th grade. It also means that we have to really give them lots of opportunity to find different books that they might be interested in, because of course they may just say, there's nothing I want to read. So, and that certainly can be challenging. One of the things that helped me, my son was a schooler up until second grade. He went to a school that pushed reading super early. So he was a proficient reader, but he absolutely hated it. And he was just like, no, I do not want to read. So when he began homeschooling, that was one of the challenges, is like, how do I find books that he is willing to sit down with? And as a reader myself, somebody who just loved to like sit down and read a book, it was very puzzling to me that this kid had zero interest. He did not find any books that he was interested in. Thankfully, we had this amazing librarian, and I would take my kids to the library weekly to try and, find something. We went into the nonfiction section, the fiction section, the young adult section. Even though he was little, we were just kind of looking for anything that might be something that he held on to. And this wonderful librarian found out that he loved Minecraft. And it turned out that there were these Minecraft novels that had just come out. And she brought one over, and we had a relationship with her, and she said, Clark, I just got these books in to the library, and I was wondering if you could read them and let me know how they are so I know if I should recommend them. Which was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Anyway, we can do that too, right? We can try to entice our kids in that way by offering them like, hey, so and so said this book was really good. I'm wondering, what you think. So that was super helpful, and it totally tapped into Clark's interest. Minecraft had just come out. He was obsessed. All he wanted to do was play Minecraft. And these books were a storyline that went along with the game. And then we found books that explained different parts of the game. So there was a book on redstone. There was a book on, I don't know what. Anyway, got all of those. And those became motivating because in order to continue to play the game, he needed to read, because I didn't know anything about it, and he didn't have any friends. That it was a brand new game. He didn't really know what he was doing. And so that really got him reading a lot. Would I have thought, oh, Minecraft books, these are the thing. No, I would not have. But once I realized how motivated he was based on his interest, he started reading. And then eventually he stopped disliking reading because he was reading so much of what he did like. And then he started picking up other books as the time went on. But those Minecraft books really hooked him back into reading and kind of took away the stigma that he had that reading was boring and a miserable experience. So, and I've seen that a lot. I had a lot of kids when I taught high school and middle school. A lot of my students had dyslexia, autism, different learning differences. They came in, they were very proud of the fact that they had never read a book in their life. And I had a huge library in my classroom of books that were high interest young adult lit books. And what I would do was I would read the first page or two, get right to that point where you want to know what's going to happen next. And then I would stop and put the book down. And there would be a race to see who could get the book first. We can, it's not really tricking, but it's definitely inviting our kids into reading when they don't want to, right? So choice, so important. Another thing that I have found so helpful with my students and my kids are audiobooks and read alouds. Even though they are not practicing their skills in terms of fluency and decoding and whatnot, they are still practicing all the reading strategies that we want our kids to be able to use, especially as they get older and the texts get harder. And if their goal is to go to college or go to a trade school, they're going to be reading. Even if they're, just going to be an adult, we have to figure out medical documents, right? And taxes and all the things. And so these skills, inference, prediction, visualization, summarization, connection, evaluation, these are things that they need to practice so that they can use them forever. And you do that. If you're a reader, you're doing these things all the time, even if you don't realize you are. It's comprehension and analysis. And so we want to give them as many ways possible to practice these. I'll talk a little bit here in ways that we can, but audiobooks invite kids to do that. And that was another way that I helped my son continue to grow as a reader. He didn't like being read to as he got older. And so we would just get tons and tons of audiobooks. And he went to bed listening to audiobooks. He's 18, he still goes to bed listening to audiobooks. My daughter, on the other hand, while she does like audiobooks, she still loves being read to. And so even though she's 14, we always have a read aloud that we may not read together every night like we did when they were little, but we are still reading together, and it's something she wants to do. Again, she picks the book, even if I'm like, great, I get to read about dragons or whatever. We still read it, and we stop and discuss it as we're reading. It's a great connection, way to connect as well. So never ever think that audiobooks and read alouds aren't reading, because they absolutely are. Another thing that can be really motivating for kids is book clubs. I started one recently for Creative ELA. Sometimes when kids know that they get to meet with their friends and talk about a book, they can be more motivated to read. We also started a book club a few years ago. It's no longer, but during COVID, we did a book club just with my daughter, her friends, and the moms were part of it too. And so we all read, and then each mom outside hosted a little like book party. So that was also really motivating. So just trying to think of creative ways to help kids read that aren't just read a book, take a quiz, read a book, take a quiz. Okay, another thing, read, think, respond. So this is specifically for kids who are struggling to understand what they're reading. And eventually I would say that most kids and adults do reach a point where they start to struggle. We get into classes where maybe we don't have a whole lot of prior knowledge, or it's just challenging, right? Like it's a biology class or an anatomy class or psychology or whatever. And it's just like, oh, wow, this text is challenging. Even if I'm a good reader, this is hard. So something that I've found to be super helpful, and I do this myself as a reader when I have to read texts that are challenging, is to read a little bit, pause, think about what you've read, and either write it down, which brings us to annotation, or if you're doing a read aloud or you're reading together, stop and discuss. What can happen is, and maybe this has happened to you, it certainly has happened to me, is that when we're reading a text that's challenging, we're actually looking at the page, but the information's not going into our brain. And so then we read an entire chapter and we realize that even though we were looking at the page, we were turning the pages, maybe we were even saying the words out loud, nothing seeped in. And so what we have to do when we want to teach our kids this is, and especially when the text is boring, but they need to read it, we want to teach them to read a little bit, stop, and think. I had my students get sticky notes, and so they would read a little bit, and then they would stop and they would use one of these reading strategies here on the sticky note, and then they'd put it in the book. If you have your own book, you can, have the kids highlight what they think is important, stop, highlight what's important, or write in the margin, what are their questions? What are they thinking? Can they put that information into their own words? What do they think is important? My daughter recently, this is her freshman year just beginning, and she wanted to take psychology. So I got her a psychology textbook and we started reading it, and I could see her just like glazing over. She was like, I don't think I like psychology. And we were only in like page 3 of chapter 1. And so I realized that part of it was me reading to her, or her just reading out loud. It just words like floating. So we stopped. I gave her a highlighter and I said, okay, I want you to read a little bit and then stop and highlight what you think is important. And that little thing totally changed her motivation and her comprehension, because instead of just trying to like get all the information that was up here, she suddenly was really paying attention to the words and the sentences and the information. So anytime our kids are reading, especially if they're going to need to write about what they're reading in some kind of like essay or, more expository type of thing, we want them to take notes, to annotate, and to really stop and think about what they're reading so that they don't get through an entire chapter and then go, I'm lost. So those are super helpful. And I use these strategies again with all of the kids that I work with reading. That's not to say that they love that, because it does make them slow down considerably, right? Especially if they just want to get it done. This makes you a slower reader, but I always try to remind them that a reader is someone who understands what they're reading, not someone who reads fast. And so while some of us are very fast readers and we can understand everything, the majority of us, I would say, need to take our time. And so while it's great to finish a book in a day, chances are if you then had to write an essay, analyze, hold a conversation, do a speech or something about that book, you would need to go back, right? And so we want to really help our kids see that taking our time, really understanding what we're reading, looking for the key concepts, being able to analyze as we're going is more important than just reading fast. Okay, a couple other things. Reading your kids' books, the books that they're interested in, can be super motivating for them. It's not always fun for you, but if we read the books that they want to read and then we can start engaging in discussions with them, that can be exciting for them to get to talk about the thing that they love, and it can make them want to read more. It also creates that connection, and they see that you value reading. You also think it's important. Okay, a couple more things. I think variety is really key, especially if you're using a curriculum or you want your child, for instance, as they get older, to read something like Shakespeare. So some kids love Shakespeare. They can read the original text and it's a breeze and they think it's great. I would say the majority, that is not the case. So when I had to teach Shakespeare, which I did when I taught in schools, what I would do is I used a variety of different texts. So we would look at the original text in small chunks, and we would look at how Shakespeare, wrote, the different ways that he, was he using couplets? Was he doing soliloquies? We learned about the language of the type of writing he was doing. We also talked about like the history of why he wrote this way and where he was writing and all of those things. But just a little bit of this stuff, because again, the majority of kids, it was just like, I don't really find this interesting at all. So then what I did was I would find texts that were the same. They were more like fan fiction. So for instance, Romeo and Juliet, I was required to teach every year to ninth graders. And so I also used a great book by Sharon Draper called Romeo and Julio, which was a modern day telling of Romeo and Juliet. My kids, especially my reluctant and struggling readers, ate this book up. And then we would watch the movie Romeo and Juliet. So they got experience reading the original language. They knew that story back and forth. They could discuss what happened in Romeo and Juliet. They practiced reading, right? We discussed it. We were able to compare the Sharon Draper book with the movie with what we had read. And so sometimes I think, and I see this with teachers in schools too, it's like, well, we have to read every word. And that's just not true. We want to think about our goals. What is our goal? Our goal is to help our kids become proficient readers and writers. What are the goals and how can I help them do that? And there's a lot of really great, there's graphic novels for the harder books. There's the books that have the original language on one side and then a translated, like a summary version on the other. Those are terrific. So you can really compare and see. So just being open to variety, to really helping our kids experience a book, a story, one of the classics in multiple ways. Because if we just say you're going to read Romeo and Juliet and they space out or they can't understand it or they just refuse, then they haven't done it, right? And so how do we meet our goals and their goals and get them motivated? And then the last thing that I think super, super important for readers is to read daily, especially my kids who, again, really either struggle with reading or just absolutely hate it, is finding different ways to help them practice that reading all the time. And I'll show you some ways here that we can do that. So my daughter was very reluctant. She's always homeschooled. She didn't want to have anything to do with reading. She didn't want to have any, thing to sit down and learn her phonics, none of this stuff. While we are more interest-led and unschooled, I also really wanted her to know the phonics and whatnot. And so one of the ways that I encouraged her to read is that she really, really, really loved going to the Humane Society, the Pound, and they would let her come in and we would sit in the cat room and she would read to the cats. And then we'd go into the area where all the dogs were and she would read to the dogs. And these were books that she thought were maybe not her favorite, like they weren't as good as the books that I was reading to her, but they were helping her with the different phonics that I wanted to make sure that she, was understanding, and highly motivating because we could go to the animal shelter. So that was one way that I motivated her when she was little. Library programs often have, summer reading programs and things like that. If your kids are motivated by rewards, you can always create one at home. So do contests, do you read so many pages, we go out for ice cream, this kind of stuff. If that works for your kids, I say absolutely. And again, we want to remember that they're reading what they want to read as well, not just what we want them to read. And so maybe they're really interested in comic books or like manuals, like my son was, to learn how to play Minecraft, or maybe they're really interested, maybe there's some kind of magazine out there that would be motivating for them to read. So we can, again, make sure there's a variety of reading materials out there, but encouraging them to read as often as possible. Another thing that I have found really helpful is games, and having the kids read the instructions and then teach you how to play the games. So, a lot of reading can be the real world type stuff. Let's say you get a piece of furniture that needs to be put together, or a new electronic that needs to be put together. Have them read the instructions or help you read the instructions and put it together. That can be super. My kids loved, when they were in elementary school, middle school, loved putting together furniture and things, which was like fine with me, but they had to read the instructions. And then, like I said, games can be such a great way. And if you can find reading games, games that are really encouraging reading, even better. If they're really interested in cooking, have them read the recipe and help you cook dinner. So any way that you can, restaurants, having them read the menu, signs, just there's words all around us. And so we just want to find ways. We don't have to say, we're going to practice reading and going to a restaurant. No, don't say that, because then they're going to be like, no. But just look for different ways that you can just really encourage them constantly to be reading. Filling out a form is another great way. If they maybe want to be a volunteer, instead of you filling out their form, have them fill out the form. Okay. I know I'm talking really fast because we're almost halfway through and it's like, I have other things I want to tell you. Okay. Pen pals, another great way to help readers because they get that email or that letter and they got to figure out how to read it and they want to read it. They want to know, what did someone say to them? So whether it's having grandma and grandpa write, your friends, kids, joining a pen pal program, again, bringing things into their lives that they really want to read. Another thing that I have done quite a bit with students, including high schoolers, I had and have had a number of high schoolers who really struggle with reading. And so what we do is we take turns. They read until they feel done, and then I read. Sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a page, and we just keep going back and forth. It also allows us that moment to pause, to think about, okay, what did we just read? And make sure that they understood what they read before they go on. So even with our older kids, taking turns reading, if they're open to that, can be super helpful. If your child is very much wants to tell it, they are a storyteller and they love, the idea of telling their stories and seeing it in print, but the idea of writing their story out is maybe too much. What you can do is have them dictate the story to you or dictate it to a speech to text and then read it back to you to make sure that it's what they want it to say. So again, then they're reading, even though they didn't write it all down, that's okay, because we want to think about our goals. And so they dictate it and then read it. I just took a class for teachers on using AI in the classroom, which I may do like a separate class on that, because I think homeschoolers could really, even though it's a little bit scary, some of the stuff that AI can do, there are some really cool things that we can do with AI to help our kids learn. So for instance, if your kid is like super interested in Star Wars or something, and you could say to AI, I want you to write I want you to write a story for 7th graders that takes place in blah, 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 blah. And they'll write the story and then the kids can read it. Or they, even better, could go onto AI and say, write me a story about blah, 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 and then they can read it. So technology can be a huge help. And then the last thing with reading is people are oftentimes wondering about like vocabulary and helping our kids. I think one of the best things that we can do is to use those words, to model them. If you're doing a vocabulary unit, keep them posted. See how many times you can find them when you're reading. See how many times you can use them in a sentence. Make a game of it. Keep track, keep tally. If you are leaving your kids notes maybe for something. I leave my kids a lot of notes, or your kids are texting, use the big words. Like that's the best way to help them become part of their own vocabulary, is for them to just see them over and over and over again, right? Sometimes when we get vocabulary lists and we just memorize them and then we go on to the next vocabulary list, at least in my experience, certainly as a student, if I studied, because I wasn't a very good student, if I studied, I did it for the test and then I didn't remember anything. So we got to make sure that we're using them. Okay, I'm going to move on to writers, and then I'm going to take some questions and look at the comment box. Struggling and reluctant writers, things are really similar for readers, because I really believe reading and writing go hand in hand. So letting our kids choose their topics and their genres. If your kids are in my classes, this is a big thing. It's so important because, again, who wants to write about something that they care less about? Not me. I don't want to do it. They don't either. So really making sure that they are able to choose. And then once they become more confident, proficient writers, they're going to be much more likely and capable to write the analysis for Romeo and Juliet if that's what they have to do, right? But if they've only had to write what they've had to write and they do not like, it's going to be hard for them to get the proficiency and the interest. Another thing that can be really important if, for instance, your curriculum or your student is interested in, let's say, writing poetry, then you want to get them lots and lots of poetry books. If they need to write an essay, pull up a lot of essays and let them see what it should look like and discuss, what is the author doing here? Because while there is no one way to write an essay or one way to write a poem, if we've never actually read essays and are expected to write them, that's pretty hard. And we don't want to just give them one, because then they potentially think, well, this is what an essay looks like, I got to copy it just like this. So we want to try to pull lots and lots of different examples from that genre. And if we can, again, trying to find examples that are part of their interests, that they want to read. And this is where, again, AI can come in really helpful. In a really helpful way, because you can say, write an expository essay about blah, 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 whatever their interest is. So creative writing, I only teach creative writing classes pretty much, even though I work with kids on expository writing. Why? Because one, I prefer that type of writing, and I think I'm a better teacher when I teach what I love. But two, I think it can just be so much more motivating than expository writing. Again, when I had kids in middle school and high school who came in and they couldn't write a complete sentence, they were much more motivated to tell me about the time that they did some kind of like flip on their skateboard, or tell me about their dog, or tell me this story that they had been brewing about, than if I gave them a subject and a topic to write about. So creative writing is my number one key to helping kids with writing. Another thing is to really make sure that they know that writers do messy first drafts. So many kids, especially our perfectionist kids, think that they have to get the page perfect. If they're going to write, it has to look perfect. No spelling, no grammar. It needs to all be in sequence and flow and all those things. If you're a writer, you know this. If you talk to a writer, they would tell you this. The first couple drafts are messy. In fact, Anne Lamott, who's a wonderful writing teacher, she has an expletive that she calls the messy draft. Some people call them zero drafts. We really want to encourage our kids to embrace this, to not try to aim for perfection, because then that critic on the side of our, on our shoulder starts saying like, well, you're not a good writer because it's not perfect. And the fact is that nobody's writing is perfect. And we want them to know that it's okay to have lots of spelling mistakes and lots of punctuation mistakes and all these things when they're first writing, because that's what writers do. So we really want to encourage that imperfection, because they can't grow as writers unless they get words on the page. They got to get those words on the page first. Now, once they do get words on the page, which is great, then we do want to start teaching them revision and editing, and we want to help them, become more proficient in that. And that's where I think the editing checklist is one of the very best tools. I have this on my website. Essentially, all it is a list that you and your student create where you are looking at their writing, you're noticing what have they not either learned or mastered yet, and you start not 100 things, but just maybe the first time you put like 2 things. So right before here, I was with a student that I work with every week. This is what we do. We created an editing checklist. He's writing this sci-fi fantasy story. He's in 5th grade, writing a sci-fi fantasy story, and outside of class. And then he comes to me every week and he reads me his story. And then I either teach him something if it's clear he hasn't learned it or remembers it, or I remind him of the things that we've put on his editing checklist. And so then he goes back through and it's like, oh, that's right. I need to have, there's a difference between ITS and IT''S, or here's a word that I always spell incorrectly. I need to look for that word, or I've got to capitalize proper nouns. And so then once they start to master those things, then you keep adding to the list. And they can add to the list, of course, as well. If they realize, like, I spell there, and there wrong every time, have them put it on the list and then keep it next to their writing so that they can keep referring to it. Once they got their messy first draft done, then they can go back and find those things. Well, the cool thing about this is, and this kid that I was just talking to his mom, I would say 90% of the stuff on his editing checklist, he is now doing automatically because he's been practicing. So it really works. And in my opinion, it works so much better than any kind of workbook where kids are, you know, fixing sentences, because they're actually doing it in their own writing. So editing checklist, great for any age. You could do this with very early, young, beginning writers all the way up through college students should keep an editing checklist. A couple quick things: speech to text. I've had a lot of students who the act of writing, whether I'll say to them, why do you hate writing? The pencil feels awful in my hand, or they haven't learned really to type, or maybe they just don't have the coordination to type or to really hold. Well, speech to text is a phenomenal tool. And I had students who were, writing on a second or third grade level be able to use speech to text to dictate a story that was well beyond their grade level. And then how do you help them with writing? Well, once they get that story, then you go through with them, or have them go through, if they can independently, use that editing checklist and start looking for, okay, because one, speech to text isn't perfect, and two, they're going to want to add things, they're going to want to revise things. So starting with a messy first draft that they haven't had to go through the pain and torture of actually using their hands or typing is a great way to get them writing and kind of already get that first draft on the page. And then again, they can continue to practice revising and editing, which again, what is our goal, right? We want our kids to become writers. So I just am a huge proponent of using technology when we need to. And yes, physical therapists will say we need to get those fine motor skills working. I agree. I would say use Legos and other things, but if you only do it with writing, it could really get your kid to be against writing. And so figuring out other ways, and sure, we can still get them holding pencils and practicing those things. I'm not suggesting not to do that, but they're going to miss a whole lot of writing instruction and writing practice if we're waiting for those fine motor skills to come into play. So we can do both. In terms of spelling, when I taught children at a school that was just for kids with dyslexia, we used Orton Gillingham. And as someone who was taught it was like called whole language reading, and I am continue to be a pretty poor speller, I don't recommend that unless you have a kid who just naturally understands the English language. So for spelling programs, I would definitely, especially if you have a struggling speller or you're just starting out with them learning spelling, use a phonics-based instruction. And that way, when they're reading or when they're writing, you can say to them, like, okay, what is the ch sound after a short vowel? And then they can be like, oh, it's TCH, or it's this or that. And so we can start actually helping them with their reading and their spelling at the same time. So those are two All About Spelling is another one. There's many out there, but I wouldn't use whole language. I would always use phonics. And then the last thing, and one of the people who couldn't be here today was asking about vocabulary and how to really help kids increase their vocabulary. And so games, I think, are one of the best ways. And again, trying to use words in everyday speech, making up funny stories, drawing pictures of vocabulary words, trying to guess what it is, using them in reading and writing, having AI create a story with all the vocabulary words that you're studying, and then having them read it, having them write a story with all the vocabulary. So any kind of practice that is more real world and of course is fun. So real quick, these are, again, some of the tools that I use to help reluctant, struggling writers and kids who love to write and are very proficient. Fast writes, I think, are awesome because they really help kids get outside of that, get away from that inner critic. And I always tell them, and if your kids take my classes, you've heard me tell them every single time, don't worry about spelling and grammar. Don't worry about spelling and grammar, because I really want them to remember that that is not what we're doing right now. We are just getting our ideas on the page. Another thing that can be very motivating, this is what motivated my kids to write, is that I wrote at the same time they did. We all wrote together. And then they started seeing, oh, mom thinks this is important. And you can also do writing clubs. I used to do at that the creative writing organization. I did a homeschool writing class, and my son and his peers came, and they loved being together, and they also wrote, which was really great. Okay, a couple other things to always be encouraging. So when our kids shows us their writing, instead of going like to yourself, or because they're gonna feel that energy and you might accidentally slip, like, oh my gosh, they don't have any punctuation and everything's spelled wrong and this sentence doesn't make any sense and I'm failing them. And don't do that to yourself, because it's not true. It's just a messy first draft. And so what I always try to do is to find one or two things that I love about their piece or that I think really works. So whether it's, look at that vocabulary word that you use, that's amazing. Or, oh, I love this sentence. I can really see the dragon flying. Because when we learn what is working, we can keep doing it. Instead of being the red pen that says wrong, 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 be the purple pen or green pen or blue pen or whatever that says, look at all these things that you are doing right. They're going to be like, oh, wow, this is okay. This isn't as hard as I thought. And then they can keep doing those things. And then again, you can go use the editing checklist after they're done or during, other mini lessons and times. And you can say to yourself, okay, I realize that my student never uses a capital letter. So let's practice this. Let's play a game where we have to, write down as many proper nouns as we can and then unscramble them. I don't know. But we can teach them outside and then of their creative writing as well, of their writing. So again, using that editing checklist is such an important part, and us reading our kids' writing and noticing what are the things that they're missing, and then keeping a list that we can then go back and help them, but not as soon as they give us the writing. Because again, if you write something and you give it to me and I look at it and I go, well, I mean, there's a lot wrong with it, you're not going to want to share your writing with me again. You may not want to write again, right? And so the more we encourage, the more they're going to write. Just like reading, the more we can encourage them to write as often as possible, the better. Whether it's letter writing, coming up with their own recipes. My kids, when they were younger and even now, love to experiment with cooking. And so, okay, we'll write the recipe down, right? Emails, texting, photo books. My son was super motivated after we got back from a big trip to go on to Snapfish and put all of his pictures and then write all of the stories and stuff that went with the pictures. And then after he was done, before we printed it, we got to practice that revising and editing together because he wanted to have a book that, that didn't have errors. Writing groups can be super motivating. Games. I really love the cranium games. I often find them at like secondhand stores because they're a little bit harder to find around here, like in stores, but then I get them for really cheap. But they have a ton of writing games, and there are a bunch online too. But any way that we can play with writing and just take away the seriousness of it, I think is so important. And then real world stuff, if your kids are entrepreneurial and they want to start a business, okay, well, we got to come up with the business plan. If they want to start a YouTube channel, okay, well, we've got to, there's writing involved there. Are you going to write a script before you go on and talk, or are you you have to come up with a description of what your channel is about? And, and letting them know that one of the ways that we communicate through writing is by making sure that we are clear and concise, and we're using the same spelling and the same, rules and whatnot, so they can, again, write that messy first draft, but then in order to be published, we need to clean it up. So those can be some helpful ways that I have found with my kids, with my students. I'm going to take a breath. Okay. Suggestions of where to look for high interest books for a teen who is a struggling reader. Yes. So your librarian is going to be a great person to do that if you have access to a librarian. Another thing is to, you can, and I can send this to you, Jen. There are lists of books online specifically for high schoolers or middle schoolers, who are struggling readers and high interest, that are high interest. Um, and then also pairing it with an audiobook. So sometimes that can be helpful, is to have them listen and read at the same time if they're willing. But there are a ton of authors, even if it's not directed towards like what they would be reading in 9th grade, 10th grade, or 11th grade. There are lots of books that are still about subjects that they are experiencing, topics, ideas, emotions, and things that they're experiencing in those age levels, but are written for an audience that isn't like, analyzing Shakespeare. So yeah, and I can absolutely put some authors and some lists together. Any other questions? Yeah, those books, the high interest books that were really written for teenagers, but again, not on a level that they're expected to like, like To Kill a Mockingbird, where they're expected to decipher a whole bunch of different dialect and history and things like that, have been so helpful for my older struggling readers. Hunger Games is of course Harry Potter, but then there's other ones that are much smaller. Those books are thick, so they can be daunting. So there's some good thinner books out there that that kids will just want to eat up. Twilight, I will say, I had probably 3 or 4 girls when Twilight came out. They increased their reading level by like 3 grades, even though Twilight is not considered to be, they were struggling readers, and they wanted to read that book so badly. And one girl, I mean, she must have had 200 sticky notes in that book, because she read and stopped to understand what was happening and whatnot. It was a really cool experience. And like, if I had said, no, you can't read Twilight in my class, it would have really changed the way she is as a reader, because every book, there's like 4 or 5, she was a stronger and stronger reader. And it improved her reading way more than a book that, she should have been reading in her grade level. I will say that something else that helped was, because Twilight was such a popular book at the time, and so many of my kids were reading it, we started a Twilight book club, and a bunch of teachers read it too. And so then we all talked about it. And that was really motivating, because then the kids wanted to come in and find out what chapter we were on and what did we think. Were we team Edward? Were we team Jacob? All those things. So here again, an example of like reading books that you normally maybe would not want to read, but so motivating and really helped. Okay, this hour is flying by. I want to just share with you a couple of these things real quick. And if I'm talking like speedy, like just totally speed talking, and you're like, oh my gosh, you'll be able to rewatch this, or always connect with me with other questions. Okay, so kind of changing gears a little bit, but it does in fact relate to reading and writing. So one of the things that I realized as a homeschooler was that if I was just homeschooling around my goals or the curriculum's goals, my kids were like, I'm not interested in this. 9 times out of 10. And so what we started doing when they were pretty little is having, before school started and then also throughout the year, anytime things kind of started to feel a little wonky, quite frankly, we would sit down and we would talk about our goals. What are the things that you want to learn? What are the things that you want to do? Now, we can say, I want you to have a reading goal, or I want you to have a writing goal, or I want you to have a math goal, or whatever. But I also think it's important for them to be able to dream and set goals that they're really interested in. So, like, I want to create a world in Minecraft, or I want to hike every trail, or I want to find out why blah blah blah, right? So we just make a list, just generate it as much as you can. What are your goals for, if you're an athlete, if you're a musician, if you're a dancer, if whatever it is, what are your goals? Write them all down. And you do the same thing. Think about, what are your goals as a homeschool mom or dad? What are your goals as you, what do you want to do this school year, right? What do you want to learn? And do this together so that everyone can see it. You can have fun with it. If they're artsy kids, you can put stickers and paint and all that kind of stuff, or you can type it. But the idea is to just have a piece of paper that says, here are my goals. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to learn. And then put it somewhere where you and your family can see it, so that when your student comes to you and says, I'm bored, or I don't want to do math, and it starts to become a problem, you can say, okay, well, you're bored. You have this whole sheet of things you said you wanted to do this year. Is there something on there that you could do? And then hopefully they look and go, oh yeah, that's right. I wanted to create a comic strip, or I wanted to, blah, blah, blah. And if they're like, I don't want to do, my son was like very anti-math. Well, his goal was to transition to school. And I said, okay, well, you don't have to do math, but I'm going to tell you that your goal is to go to school, and your peers are going to know these things. So maybe we just need to take a break, and then we can come back to it. And then he, remembering his goal, was like, oh yeah, I do want to go to school, and I don't want to not know everything that's going on in the math classroom. Our goal may be, they want to start a business. I don't want to write a business plan. Well, how are you going to know all the things that you need to know in order to create a business, right? So it can be just a really great way to remind our kids and to motivate our kids, and also to see what are they really interested in, and also to help them think beyond just tomorrow, so that they start to think about, like, as they're learning and as they're growing, like, do I want to go to college? Do I want to do this? What are the things that we want to do? Now, of course, these change. We're not like holding them down, like this is a promise you made. And that's why it can be helpful to revisit the goals throughout the year and add to them, because then you can be like, you know what? It turns out that I actually do not want to do this whatsoever. Well, we're going to put it on the back burner. And then you can think, okay, well, maybe great, they don't want to do math. So now I've got to think about other ways for them to get motivated, but at least you can then start thinking in that direction, and they feel like they have autonomy, which I have found is the number one way to get kids learning. Another thing is our expectations, to really think about, okay, when you have your goals, so what do you need to do to meet your goals? For instance, if I want to, my daughter wants to be an artist who has her own business, she has to be able to balance her books and things. So that's where her motivation comes in, to learn math, because she's going to have to learn all of the personal finance things in order to run her own business. For my son, learning math now, he's in trade school to be a mechanic for Porsche. He's doing a ton of math because he has to learn all about electricity and the different things that have to do with cars. And so what is his goal? To be a mechanic? Well, look, then you got to learn this math stuff. And so we can start that early. And then we want to think about, what are our expectations? Like, how can we support their goals? Are we expecting something that they absolutely do not want to do at this moment in their life? And is it worth the fight? Are our expectations relevant? Are they necessary? And then we, of course, have to also look at our state's homeschool expectations. And so kind of trying to balance those and really knowing like what are the choices, what do we have to do and what's optional. And that leads us to scheduling. And I know we're like 1 minute away from one. So, but here's how we make a schedule in our home. We make a list of the things that we have to do. We make a list of the things that we want to do, and we think about what we can manage. And then we go from there in terms of choosing activities, choosing classes. Again, we're thinking about our goals and our expectations. And I'm able then to set some boundaries for myself. We're able to set some boundaries for our budget. We're able to really look at the big picture and say like, okay, there's no way we can do all of these things within a day or within a month. How about we change, we wait a couple months, my daughter, for instance, is starting a college class, a ceramics class. It's very expensive. So we looked at the other activities that she's doing and we put the ones that cost money on hold until she's done with that class. That allowed me to not be driving around a bazillion hours a week. It allowed our finances, and it also allowed her to still meet her goals without overburdening all of us. So this is a way that's been really helpful. And I do this with my kids because I want them to be able to do this on their own. And so just really kind of helping them to see the bigger picture and not just be told every day, here are the things that we're doing, but involve them in that. All right, everybody, that's, let me see. Sarah says, okay. Any other, I know this was a lot of information in an hour, but I'm so grateful for you all for sticking around and listening to me. And I hope that there was one or two little tidbits of something that is helpful going forward into your homeschool. Any questions or thoughts that, oh, I see. Any ideas about resources for learning more about incorporating technology? I'm happy to send you the webinar that was just, it's a free webinar that two teachers put on about using AI in the classroom. I found it really helpful because they talked about the different advantages and disadvantages and some of the ways that they used AI for, now this is for classroom, but I mean, I think you can absolutely apply it to homeschooling. There is a, so there's, lots of different AI type forums out there or types. There's a new one called Student AI. I have not gone on. I don't know exactly what it looks like. I don't know how expensive it is. I'm pretty sure there's a free version, but apparently it is the best one. It's what schools are using for kids to keep their information safe. So that was what was recommended because of course, like the Chat GPT and all those things, we don't want to put personal information in there. And even our own writing in there is essentially, we don't know where that's going, but this student AI is apparently much more protected. So that is one thing that I learned from this, but I can also send you the webinar. And, I think AI in the classroom and homeschooling, this is such a new thing. Teachers, my husband as a professor, everyone's just kind of trying to figure out what to do. And ultimately, and I agree with this, I think a lot of people are thinking to themselves, okay, it's not going away. So how do we teach our kids how to use it as a tool? How do we as educators use it as a tool in a safe way that also helps our kids learn? Like, how can we, not just block it, because ultimately it's here and it's just going to become, it's like cell phones, right? Or the internet. Like, it's just, so how can we really use it in a way that is beneficial? And yeah, okay. Technology. Okay, so one technology, Jen, that can be really helpful if you haven't heard of it before is called Dragon. This is an older technology. I used it a lot with my students who were nonverbal. And it is a great way for them to listen to different texts. There's all sorts of different ways that you can do that, that you can use it. So Dragon is a good one. And then another thing that I don't know if your child can write, but there's also a pen, that you can get like at Best Buy, different things, and whatever you write is actually transcribed into the computer, and so then the computer can read back the writing to them. So, or you as the scribe could do something, and then it goes onto the computer for them, and then the computer can read to them. So again, without knowing your daughter's, yeah, there are so many cool things out there. Absolutely. I was just watching on Instagram a family whose child is nonverbal, and they were using her eyes to be able to communicate. Back when I was in the classroom and I worked with nonverbal students, they had like a piece of paper that had certain words and letters and stuff, and the aides were taught how to put enough pressure on their hands so that the kids could answer questions and do things like that. And that was super cool because I'd be able to ask the student a question and they'd be able to answer me by pointing to different things on the board, which was so helpful. Yeah. A speech. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Yeah. So that's amazing. So the speech generating device, then, if there's a way for her to be able to then get that, the things that she's talking, if for instance, if you want to work on writing, to get the things that she's saying onto a document that then will also maybe read back to her and allow her to, and she's going to need help, but allow her to figure out, where does she want to add to the story, where does she want to take away, these kinds of things. So yeah, great questions. And I will keep looking, because there's stuff is just coming out all the time. But the pen was super helpful. That's how my husband got through graduate school and his PhD, because he would take notes, and then he would record the lecture, and then the notes would then be able to be put on the computer, and he could re-listen to them and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, I would look into Dragon first, see if that would be something that you're looking for, because that was the technology that we found was the most helpful, was Dragon. So awesome. Any other questions or thoughts before we head off into our days? Oh, thanks so much for being here, everybody. And yeah, I hope I get to see your kids in my classroom and get to connect with you again. Just real quick, just as a little marketing thing for ways I can continue to help. So for those of you that haven't worked with me before or don't know the things that I offer live and recorded classes on OutSchool and Creative ELA. Creative ELA is my business. I offer group classes, one-on-one classes, and I also work with siblings at the same time. I have creative writing classes, book clubs, pen pals, and tutoring. And then there's a bunch of resources. Some are free, some are paid. Unit studies, novel studies, writing units, reading strategies, printables. A lot of the things that I shared are on my website. They can be purchased individually or through my membership, Creative ELA. You just get it all. And then the last thing is, I do also offer mentoring, so one-on-one help for parents and teachers. So if there's something specific that you're really wanting to have like a focus, want me to help you like really focus and figure out, then that's something we can do as well. So All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. And again, thanks so much for being here. And I'll see you next time. You're welcome.